Hello, everybody. Dan Tomaszewski here with Everything MSP. I want to welcome you to today's event, the Super Admin Trap: How to Stop Access Creep Before It Causes a Security Breach. So, today we're going to be talking about how cyber attackers now exploit unmanaged IDs, weak MFA, and admin creep to move through SaaS apps into critical systems. So today's event, we're going to be breaking down how SaaS attack path and why identity governance is the next must-have for MSP defense. And I am joined today by Nathan Archie, and Nathan is with Joyces. Joyces, I just said that wrong. He's with Joyces. And how are you doing today, Nathan?
Great, thanks, Dan. And we are joyful at Joseph, so it could be
Yes.
Joseph, I suppose.
Yes. So, keeping yourself busy, my friend?
I am indeed. I'm in Sydney, and it's 71 degrees for
Yes.
an early start in the morning. But think of you guys shuddering over there in the winter. I know there's been a bit of snow and storms in
Yeah.
the last couple of weeks, especially in some of the eastern parts.
Yeah, it is, it's 16 degrees here in Michigan. However, I think, really the majority of the United States has been hammered by cold and snow,
Mm.
and, so it's definitely, not fun, but today we have a hot topic that we're gonna talk about, right?
Yep, we can melt that snow and ice away.
Exactly. So, we do know that, we have some critical things from a security perspective, especially when we start talking about SaaS apps and the such. I just want to kick things off and let's just jump right in and let's get started.
Great, thank you. So again, just to reiterate, Dan, I'm Nathan Archie. I'm the VP of Global Markets here at Joseph. And essentially, as we're kicking off the year, what I wanted to talk about today is a little bit of a hard truth. We've been thinking a lot for the last decade about hackers. We sort of think about them as being little geniuses, maybe breaking down firewalls and hacking through systems in different ways. But the reality is the landscape shifted a little. The threat's not necessarily breaking in the same way anymore. It's a hard break in. It's all about creeping in. And we call this admin creep. It's essentially the slow, invisible accumulation of access privileges, unused accounts, and those forgotten API tokens that are rotting our security from the inside out. And today, what we're going to talk a little bit about today is what is it and how do we stop it? At Joseph, why are we sort of in a position to be able to talk about this? We're a global IT company. We sort of sit in that intersection of IT and SaaS management. And we've got employees all over the globe, and we've got over 1,000 customers globally as well, in vast, very, very the core regions of the world. So Europe, US, UK, Australia, and throughout APAC as well. And despite these different geographies, we're still seeing the exact same pattern and the exact same challenges everywhere. Our clients' defense isn't really failing because they lack the sophisticated tools. There's so many amazing cybersecurity tools out there that are doing a brilliant job of protecting businesses and MSPs and their clients from hacking. But it's failing because often we've lost track of those basics, essentially understanding who has access to what, and not necessarily preventing those people who have access once they've left an organization. So essentially, our defenses have been breached. According to Microsoft Digital Defense Report in 2025, data exfiltration is now occurring in 82% of ransomware attacks. So the old strategy of, we'll just restore from the backup, it's dead. Once they steal the data, they have you. And the extortion happens whether your servers are running or not. So that's sort of, one of the biggest problems at the moment. Essentially, in 2025, the illusion of the perimeter defense finally collapsed. We realized that the walls, they just don't matter anymore if the enemy has a key. So what we like to talk a little bit about is the 1% exception. So you might be able to manage 99% of your environment perfectly, which we talked about those amazing cybersecurity tools that exist. And that includes the main office, your full-time staff, Microsoft 365 accounts. But the reality is the attackers aren't hacking the 99%. They target that 1% that everyone forgets. It's that SaaS app a marketing manager bought with a credit card. It's that contractor who left on Friday but still has login on Monday. It's that temporary admin access that was granted 3 months ago. And that's where really that 1% is lost. The war is lost in that 1%.
So I want to jump in and ask
Yeah,
you
sure.
something,
Sure.
Nathan. You know,
Please.
when we start talking about that 1%, you know, we all know that everybody is wanting to do the best they possibly can in their job, and you know, it's not like they're trying to, you know, do things to cause disruption or put the business at risk. But again, they're just trying to, you know, be more efficient at what they're doing, and you know, and just try to do the best they can. You know, you guys, you know, through your application have a lot of, you know, insight into, you know, SaaS apps that, you know, that whole shadow IT. Are you finding that it's a much bigger problem than most even, you know, ever anticipated? I mean, we all know that there's additional apps out there that people are signing up for, but you know, a lot of times they're apps that require cost. You know, and many people have some type of a purchasing card, so they simply just go ahead and add it, and don't necessarily need approval. So, um, you know, what are you finding, and you know, how big of a problem is this overall?
Yeah, it's quite significant. So what we do know is that, in terms of the statistics, the number of like admin, sorry, the number of admin, like it's around 41%, sorry, of most of these attacks are occurring through these types of situations.
Okay.
So it's quite endemic. When we're looking at that significant number and volume, it becomes a bit of a problem. And I do have some case studies that I'll talk about shortly as well that really highlight some of the challenges that and ultimately penalties that can arise from some of these issues. Because really, when it comes down to it, if we're not worried about this 1%, that's when ultimately it really becomes a considerable issue.
Right.
So what we do know, though, Dan, is like 70% of software sourcing happens outside of the IT department, right? So that's quite considerable. We also know that 59% of employees are already using AI tools without IT's knowledge. Okay, and I mentioned that sort of 41% of ultimately it's 41% of employees are using technology that IT can't see, but really the number is 83% of organizations. And this is from a study that was done globally by Microsoft, indicated that 83% of organizations have reported an identity-related breach due to unmanaged credentials. So it is quite, a significant number of businesses that are being impacted by this. And so it's something that I'm assuming most of the MSPs who are watching today or listening today would have had a client that have been impacted by this type of problem before. And ultimately, it may not necessarily have gone reported, and that's essentially what's occurring. A lot of the time, it's not reported because businesses don't necessarily find out. Like, how do you know that an ex-employee has logged in through a system and stolen some data that then they've taken to their next employee, for example?
Yeah.
It's just
Absolutely.
not something that you just wouldn't know unless there was some sort of someone was checking that audit log to tell if that person happened to log back in or something along those lines. But if you didn't know, you're not going to know.
Right.
I mean, I know people who in the past who've, left a company and not maliciously done anything, but they still had access to a SaaS application that they didn't have in their new organization and wanted to use it. And, because they're still paying, the old company was still paying for a license, like Adobe, for example. So they didn't have access to private information. And they've still used that, that app in the past because it's like, oh, my new job hasn't given it to me yet. My old job, I've still got my license. So I'm just going to use it because it helps me get my work done.
Yeah.
So it's not a malicious intent, but they still have that access.
Yeah. And, I think, especially like a new client, you're obviously going to be doing, an audit to identify what's out there. But over time, I mean, from the time that you do the audit, that audit's only as good as at the time that it was pulled. So someone could, minutes or hours after an audit's done, throw an app on there that could, cause exposure for the organization.
100%.
So, okay, perfect. I appreciate you answering that one for me.
No, of course. No, of course. It's really, I think, a pertinent question and very good to be able to deep dive. And it probably sets me up for the next little component as well, what I want to talk about, which is, and give some of these examples that have happened in the real world, which is, I think, testament to why we need to worry about these sorts of issues. So, one of the core things that we need to think about is, we're in this era of being logged into, not necessarily breached. And I touched on that at the beginning. And, it's a lot more simple these days to buy legitimate credentials on the dark web, for example, and then just walk through the front door. It's not theoretical. The price of this governance failure is ultimately also personal liability. I don't know, a lot of people here have probably done their own personal checks via, dark web searches to see credentials that have appeared on their platform, on the dark web, their personal credentials. And it's amazing how much information's actually been, tapped and stolen and put out there and staring. It's very, very scary. And, we sort of see it as three kind of key areas that I want to focus on. The first is, poor governance and what the impact of poor governance is. The second is, what does admin creep and the penalty of that look like? And then the third is, the cost of incomplete onboarding. And so I just want to take you through a few examples. So the first example that we've got there is a company called Drizzly. And this really wasn't a complex hack. So it was down to poor governance, as we touch on here. And the lapse, essentially what happened was Drizzly granted an executive access to GitHub for a one-day hackathon. And the executive never used that access again. But IT never revoked it. So it's just sat there dormant and waiting.
Wow.
And so hackers eventually used that forgotten key to breach the company. They stole data on 2.5 million customers, which was huge. But the kicker really is that the FTC didn't just fine the company. They also held the CEO personally liable and mandated a 10-year comprehensive security program. Right. So
it's incredible. I mean, just, you think about it, you're doing something that should have been very short term.
Yep.
It was part of, that.
And everyone's done a hackathon, everyone spins up these, little GitHub accounts so everyone can have a go at it, and they just forgot to turn it off. And from that, 2.5 million customers' data was stolen.
Yeah.
And again, it wasn't breached. It was just, they just logged in because those credentials appeared on the dark web and they found them and bang, off they go. And it might not even be the dark web. It could be in a phishing attempt as well in some cases too. So there's a bunch of ways that they can obviously get this information.
Yeah.
So, and then the next example is Block, or formerly Cash App. So, quite a large company. And here we talk about the penalty of admin creep. And this happens a lot, not because IT teams are lazy or inefficient. It's often because the math's broken. And so that's why we call it the penalty of admin creep. And then what we mean by the math is broken is, in a modern company, you might have 1,000 employees, for example, but you've got like 20,000 identities spread across hundreds of SaaS applications. And the policy might say revoke immediately, but the reality is it probably takes 30 minutes to manually offboard one user, sometimes even a few hours.
Yep.
Within that gap, that's where the creep thrives. So when we talk about Block, the situation there is a former employee who worked for Cash App in the Cash App investing division was terminated. Okay, and their access to internal reports wasn't cut off immediately, but it remained active after they'd left the building. Okay, they didn't have some sort of an automated kill switch to terminate all the applications. And in that delay, it allowed the former employee to simply log back in and download reports containing private financial data on 8.2 million customers. Okay, and the cost to the business there was a class action lawsuit, which they settled for $15 million.
Wow.
Yeah, so quite huge. So it just shows that, often that manual onboarding processes too, which a lot of businesses are using, and it's often done by spreadsheets, isn't, foolproof. And it can often be that liability if it's not done promptly enough or efficiently enough.
Yeah, and what's interesting is, we've all had conversations and have given these type of scenarios to prospective clients, as we're trying to bring them on board and sell them on security services. And, and sometimes they'll say, well, these are large companies. Of course, those penalties are significant for a large company like that.
Yes.
But those fines will be in relation to the size of your organization. So, these are significant fines to even these big companies.
Oh,
So for you, Mr. SMB, could you afford a penalty that is much smaller, but
yeah.
still could exceed what your revenue is?
Yep.
And so those are the challenges. I always still do like to have stories and examples, at the local level for a
Yeah.
SMB that might be local, might be more in line with the size of the organization, but in reality, it's all relative to that organization.
Yeah, exactly. And look, the last one's not, still a fairly large company, but the pain is still felt. But
Yeah,
ultimately, what I guess the point is from the first example was the CEO was personally liable.
right,
And even if you're an SMB, if you're personally liable, then that still has an impact on you as an individual.
right,
And so, if a director of a multinational or a large, not necessarily multinational, but a large, a larger company entity that has, directors and shareholders and so on and so forth, if their CEO can be liable, if that individual of an SMB is a sole trader, the impact to them is going to be even more significant. So as an individual, so that sort of 10-year comprehensive training might be, a slightly different result if it's an SMB, private owner that owns that company.
yeah.
So, huge impact personally.
So
Just the,
there is a question that came up. Andre is a question. He wants to know, where do you find SMB or local incident reports?
does that mean examples of this situation? Is that what we're
Yeah.
referring to?
Yep. Examples of, maybe smaller size
Yep.
organizations. So I'll let you go, and then I have some thoughts as well on that.
Yeah, sure. So I think there definitely are small examples. Like we do have some, and that's something that I can probably share. We can share afterwards as well if that's of
Okay.
interest. So I do have some examples that we can share with. Just took to all of these bigger ones initially, but we can 100% share some examples for smaller companies. But there are it's possible to do research just via
Yeah.
Google, ChatGPT, etc. There's definitely ways to find those, but we do have examples of those.
And some of my thoughts are, I think, unfortunately, a lot of those smaller SMB size, aren't going to hit the news like these
Mm,
large organizations
it's
are.
true.
So it won't be as easy to find them, but they're still out there. A couple thoughts I have is just through your networking, as you communicate with other MSPs in your market, outside of your market, the stories don't necessarily have to be right within your own, city or home state.
Mm,
But if they're sized right, or maybe in the same industry, those type of things can be very valuable. Other things too is, if you're part of our MSP discussion groups, which we have every Friday at 12 noon Eastern time, you can learn more at everythinmsp.com under the resources tab. It's MSP discussion group. We talk about successes, challenges, and changes that are occurring in the channel. So on those calls, from time to time, MSPs will share different incidences that maybe they've encountered, or also it might be a scenario where they've heard of other MSPs that have battled it, and also take a look at local forums. Just taking a look and seeing what's out there. I think a lot of people might, a lot of MSPs might be hesitant to share their own stories, but I think
mm.
as they have their ear to the ground and hear of other ones, you can hear them from that point as well. So Andre, we'll try to, I will make note of that. I'll have Taylor make note of your name, and we'll try to get some additional stories out to you as well.
Yep.
And thank you for
And
bringing that question up.
yeah, I think it's a great question, Dan. And just to build on what you said, I totally concur with what you said as well. But I mean, in addition, I think that a lot of the SMBs you mentioned weren't necessarily going to be reported because they're small. And I think
Yeah.
also a lot of SMBs probably wouldn't report it because they might not necessarily know as well.
Right.
I think the ability to find out that that's occurred to a smaller business might be more difficult than for a larger business because, the customer volumes, for example, are smaller. Like, we talked about 2.5 million customer details, 8.5 million customer details. I was involved with a company a while back in Australia where an ex-employee tried to take, 40,000 potential customers, like that was sort of leads. So it was, had an impact to the organization there. So it is still private data, but, and it was only sheer luck that it was able to be discovered. But as an SMB, it's much harder to, identify sometimes those breaches just because the data sets are much smaller that they're working with anyway. So,
Right.
But that's not to say it's not happening.
And then one last area to look for is reach out to your own insurance agent, and and just say, hey, do you without giving me any names, just you can fully anonymize this. Can you let me know about any stories of incidents that you've seen, that you've experienced because of cyber liability insurance? I just always love to have stories, yada, yada, yada. Try to get some local stories from that perspective too. So.
Thank you. Yeah, agree. That's a really good point too. So the final one here, Dan, is just offboarding, incomplete offboarding. And really, this is probably the most dangerous moment in an employee's life cycle. It's, that exit and ensuring that that employee has been offboarded from all the applications that they've have had access to. And in this example, the Nuance and Geisinger incident, the situation was that a former employee was terminated and their access to patient records wasn't cut off immediately. It remained active only really for 2 days post their termination. So it's not a lot of time, 48 hours. But that 48-hour delay enabled the former employee to access sensitive HIPAA data, which is very relevant in the medical industry, which ultimately led to a massive class action lawsuit, which they settled for $5 million. So really, thinking about it, that offboarding, it's got to be a binary process. It's either it's done or it's not. It's, there's no real middle ground. You can't half offboard somebody. And that's ultimately what, often occurs because the processes and the systems aren't necessarily in place to really enable it. And so what I want to talk about next then is, we've covered all these challenges. What's really, some of the solutions out there or that exists to really focus on that and to sort of solve some of these problems and how do we, support MSPs through this process? And really what it's about is, how do we develop sort of a structural change that moves us really from sort of a manual task to automated governance? And we see that happening in sort of 5 key steps. And we break those steps into sort of 2 key areas. The first is the foundational approach. And then the second component is the enforcement. So the foundational approach includes visualization and access and setting up access policies. So what does that mean? So from a visualization perspective, it's really important to understand what exists in the ecosystem. You can't secure what you can't see effectively. So starting by creating some sort of a unified ledger that connects via API to the entire environment, looking for sanctioned apps, unsanctioned apps, finding shadow IT, it really highlights that invisible 1% so that we can understand every single risk that is out there. So that's sort of that first layer that's really important within the foundation, that visualization component. The second part of it is access policies. So are we defining access policies? So a lot of organizations, you go, I've got the visualization, but have they necessarily defined access policies? And what that means is, what are the rules? Not everybody should be an admin, right? Who should be the admin? What are the granular policies that dictate who can access what? And really limiting that blast radius if a credential is ever stolen. So for example, if, it might be an SMB that you're dealing with, the owner of the company, the founder might need admin access, and yes, they might only have 10 employees, but do all 10 of them really need access to every single application? And do all 10 really need admin access to every single application? And then as you extrapolate that out with dealing with larger organizations, it becomes more pertinent question. So does, me as a junior salesperson, for example, need access to, the finance ledger, for example, or the finance tool that we're using, whether it be, let's say it's a Xero or a Sage or something like that. Do I need access to that? Probably not. So it's those sorts of access policies that are really critical to be defined within the context of any organization. And that sort of also extends to AI now too, because a lot of organizations are going, hey, we want to implement AI and we want everyone to go out and start using AI tools. What does that mean? So if everyone's starting to use AI tools, where are these AI tools storing data? And are they then taking company IP and putting that onto, open source systems and so on and so forth, which also poses, IP theft risks and so on and so forth. So there's breach and there's also IP considerations as well within the context of that. But having those access policies is really, really then becomes more critical. The next phase is that enforcement. So once we kind of understand the ecosystem, how do we manage it? And we look to how to an audit process initially. So instead of, and that's where access reviews comes into play. So a lot of businesses or MSPs are probably running access reviews for their clients, and that may, in some cases, just be limited to what's being managed by Microsoft Entra ID, for example, because that's what they can facilitate access reviews to, or they might be have rolled out Okta and they might have a little bit more of a broader scope. But are they able to, run access reviews across the entire Shadow IT ecosystem as well to really determine, does somebody need access to that system? Right? And it might need to do an access review, not necessarily to the end user, but it might need to go to their manager, for example, or to a decision maker, or to the owner of the SMB to actually make that decision and say, hey, all these people need access to that for their job or they don't. So some sort of flexibility in that access review process. And again, we want to be able to automate that process as much as possible and not really run it through spreadsheets and emails, which, poses difficulties and also limits the number of access reviews that can be run on an annual basis. Because the more visibility and more understanding we have of the organization through these sorts of thorough processes really enables us to have a little bit more systemic control. The fourth step in the process is complete offboarding. So it's essentially that safety valve. It's that kill switch, a single button that revokes access to every app instantly when an employee leaves. So no gaps, no penalties, no liabilities, no mistakes. And that's really what it comes down to. Complete offboarding is really, really a critical step in that enforcement process. And then the final element within that is autonomous management. So essentially, it's that layer that protects you while you sleep. So setting triggers so that if an account is unused for 90 days, for example, suspend it, or the system is watching the door 24/7, catching the creep the moment it happens. Without really having to lift a finger. So that's also sort of important. So how can you automate those processes? So even if an access review is conducted and I say, for example, that I no longer need access to that application, is that then an automated solution that I'm offboarded, or does it need to be a manual task that creates a ticket and so on and so forth? But as long as it's actioned as well as soon as possible, that's important. Because again, if I say complete my access review at 10 p.m. at night, and an MSP might only receive the ticket the next morning, there's still a number of hours that app is open and accessible. So if it can be automated, then it becomes instant and therefore closing the gap much, much quicker.
Absolutely. And, and I think it's one of those things that, without that automation, there's too many moving pieces when it comes to, what needs to be offboarded. And, and like you said, I mean, you could be dealing with multiple offboardings all at the same time. That could be the case, but also, depending on how large your organization is, if you have a technician that's dedicated to just doing the offboard, or you've got kind of a free for all, depending on, maybe you only have a few technicians and everybody's just kind of jumping in. There's always that risk of somebody just not being familiar with that account. And each account is going to be different, and
100%.
Different ramifications.
Definitely, and it always comes in at 4:00 on a Friday afternoon as well, or 4:30 p.m.
Right. Yeah.
That's when the client's like, "Oh, we've just decided to terminate person X," and they're
Yeah.
leaving us now this afternoon. Can you please, offboard them? And it's like, oh,
Yep.
there
You always
goes
love
dinner with the
those.
family.
Yeah. Yeah. You always love those clients that do, submit the ticket saying, in 2 days, we will be at this time
Yeah.
doing an
Yeah.
offboarding, and you get some advance notice.
Yes.
But, we all know that's, in a perfect world, if we could rule the world, they all be like that.
100%.
Yeah.
Definitely. So I guess the last part for me is just to thank you, hopefully shed some light on admin creep, from what's occurring out there, and how the inevitability of it in a growing business, growing globally, is occurring, but ultimately it doesn't have to be fatal. We just got to think about how do we move from trust but verify to zero trust and verify constantly. And that's what that automation ultimately does. And one of the things that, that's what we've been thinking a lot about at Joseph, is how do we enable a platform that solves these problems? And that's essentially what we've sort of, we've been building away in the background. We enable that visibility. And one of the key things that we're really excited about, and that we've just launched in the last few weeks, we were testing it with a few customers last year, is essentially an integration tool that can build into any application and enable that offboarding. It can do onboarding as well, but offboarding in a much more broad scope, because typically building out those integrations is a very manual process via API, and a lot of apps just don't have APIs that enable it.
Right.
That's just not what they've built into their own stack. So we've tried to find a way to navigate around that and really help our customers offboard very simply and quickly. And then also automation is also our big focus. So we do have the ability to have access reviews, and then say someone says they don't need said app, it would automatically offboard them from that application.
You mentioned a little bit, like we're talking about SaaS apps and being able to identify those. And, I know when we spoke earlier this week, we talked a bit about some of the visibility components, because you got the visibility and then you've got the management aspect of it. Can you shed a little bit more light on that visibility component, and how you, at least, especially if you're in that onboarding process with a new client, you get that visibility so you can determine what kind of remediation needs to be done, what kind of management needs to be put in place before you get to the management aspect of it?
Sure. Yeah. So the visibility, as I mentioned earlier, is critical. You can't manage what you can't see and what you don't know about, right? So our platform taps into the OAuth logs of the IDP. So whether that be Microsoft or Google. And so we can historically see all the different applications that users or endpoints have logged into using their credentials, right? So because they typically leave a mark on the OAuth log, whether or not they're using SSO or not. So it doesn't really make a difference, but they will ultimately leave that. So we're able to pick those up, and we can identify that. And we can pick up over 60,000 apps via that methodology. So, there's not many apps around the world that we don't have visibility over that someone's logged into. We also have sort of an extra layer, which is a browser extension, which we deploy to. So that gives a little bit more understanding around utilization. And that's predominantly because, invariably what happens is some applications don't always log you out when you've logged in. So LinkedIn, for example, if someone's using LinkedIn, or if they've used it recently, every time you go back onto your LinkedIn site, you're not logging back into LinkedIn. So therefore, it's not necessarily going to leave a credential mark on the auth log. But the browser extension will be able to pick that up. So that's where that process is super important. So we provide that comprehensive visibility as to what's being used by across the organization to start on that level of visibility.
Excellent. And and then as we, go from that visibility into the actual day-to-day management, because as we talked about, we can get that initial visibility and that initial audit today. However, it's that ongoing management and ongoing visibility that is so critical. Can you elaborate a little bit more about how you assist with that?
Yes. So that platform system of discovery operates 24/7. So anytime there's a new app, there's sort of, an alert XYZ app is starting to be used, and then you can make comprehensive decisions based on risk profiling to determine, is it an approved app or not, or, are we aware of it, and it can be, highlighted to the client. And that's kind of critical. And then the ongoing management, also progresses around access reviews, and also that, governance with respect to offboarding. So we enable onboarding, offboarding capabilities as well through the platform. So it's really that entire employee life cycle. But what's really critical is the definition of those access policies. So that's also something that we, find is super important in terms of helping manage on an ongoing basis.
And are you able to find out whether the SaaS app has MFA enabled?
Yes. Yeah, that's something as well that we can pick up and we can detect. So if it's been enabled, and we can determine who has it enabled and who doesn't. And again, if we can see a cohort of people that haven't enabled it, you might want to say, hey, I want to run an access review of those individuals. So that can also be done too.
And just for our audience, I mean, can you explain a little bit more about why that is so critical today?
Yeah, well, I think it's super critical just from a security perspective, in terms of, we talked about the entire premise of the discussion was really that sort of admin, that creep essentially,
Yeah.
and people having access to, being able to not necessarily breaching, but stealing credentials and then being able to use them to get into systems. And that MFA capability ultimately helps prevent that, because even if someone's stolen my credentials, if they don't have access to my phone, for example, and I'm running that MFA through the phone, then it helps an additional layer of security to prevent them from getting in. So it's definitely important, if there's, apps that can be MFA enabled, that they are. Unfortunately, in not all cases they will be, and especially if it's one of those apps that's a shadow IT, for example, that one person in the organization has decided to sign up for their credit card, they probably aren't necessarily going to put MFA on it unless they're forced to.
Okay.
Yeah.
Excellent. I don't know that we have any other questions at this time. Any parting words? I know there is a demo QR code there for our audience that want to give Joseph a try out.
Yes,
can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, we do have a full demo environment that someone can. We've actually got two sort of demos that we'll be launching shortly. We've got one currently on our site. So, sorry, I'll step back. So this demo, book a demo, is with our team. We've got a team in the US, whilst I'm in Australia, but we do have boots on the ground in the US, and our team would be more than happy to catch up with anybody to take them through our platform and then show them exactly how it works with respect to the admin creep challenges that we talked about today, or anything else that they would be interested in. Through our website at josephs.com, you can also sign up for a full-fledged demo environment, which has mock data in there that you can have a play with, if that's something that you prefer as well.
Nathan, you've done an excellent job today. Greatly appreciate your time and your knowledge. For everybody listening today, thank you so much for being here with us. To learn more about Josys, you can go to their website, josys.com. You can also use the QR code to book a demo and learn more from them as well. Of course, if you are on the everythingmsp.com website, you can search for them and you can get some additional information and reach out to them directly from our site too. Everybody have a great rest of your day, and we will talk to everybody soon. Take care, everybody.